Somewhere in the dry winds between Cairo and Istanbul, a letter once vanished. It was never urgent, only important. And like many things in the Ottoman Empire, it moved slowly, deliberately, sometimes never at all. But what if I told you, that delay was part of the design? In tonight's journey through history, we'll follow the quiet footsteps of messengers, the groan of camel caravans, and the secrets tucked inside dusty scrolls. This is Whisper Sleep Histories, and if you stay with us till the end, you might just learn how empires were held together, not by armies, but by letters that were almost never on time. Somewhere, in the wavering heat of a late afternoon sun, a piece of folded parchment flutters. It is sealed with a faded blob of wax, its crimson now dulled to the color of dried clay. The ink, once bold, has begun to feather at the edges, not from water, but from time. The letter is not lost, not exactly. It is simply delayed. Which, in the grand tradition of the Ottoman postal system, is less of a flaw and more of a feature. Before the world clicked and chirped with instant notifications, before messages could cross continents faster than a blink, there was a time when letters traveled at the pace of hooves and weather. This particular letter, let's say, began its journey somewhere in Damascus, addressed to a minor official in Istanbul who had been waiting, somewhat patiently, for news of a cousin's engagement. Or perhaps it was an invoice for a shipment of figs. No one remembers anymore, and no one kept a copy. What matters is that it was sent, and that it moved, slowly, through the machinery of an empire built on distance, dust, and determination. In the sprawling dominion of the Ottoman Empire, which at its peak touched 3 continents and juggled dozens of languages, religions, climates, and cuisines, communication was not just a convenience. It was survival. Orders needed to travel from the palace to the provinces, taxes needed to be recorded and returned, and betrayals, always a few steps ahead of official channels, needed chasing. But the means of transmitting those vital packets of ink and intent were, let's just say, not exactly streamlined. Imagine a system where your letter might be handed from a horseback courier to a camel-mounted one, then dropped off at a stone-walled rest station, left to sit until the next rider arrived, which could be tomorrow, or next week, depending on weather, tribal skirmishes, the condition of the road, or whether the courier's horse had thrown a shoe. There were no tracking numbers. There was no insurance. There was just hope. And maybe a tiny prayer scribbled in the margin. It was a system that functioned less like a network and more like a set of overlapping favors, habits, and inherited routines. Some messages were marked urgent, although in Ottoman terms, urgent still allowed for a week or two of contemplation. Others were deemed sensitive, which meant they might be intercepted and read long before reaching their intended audience, especially if the audience was someone the Sultan had grown suspicious of. But most letters, the ones about grain shipments, building repairs, or requests for a better mattress in a provincial governor's residence, simply drifted along the arteries of empire like quiet exhalations, too slow to alarm, too ordinary to notice. And yet, despite the delays, the detours, the occasional disasters involving floods or bandits or misdirected camels, the Ottoman postal system worked. Not quickly. Not always efficiently. But steadily. Relentlessly. Like a mule with a purpose. Because underneath all the grandeur of domes and palaces, beneath the velvet turbans and shimmering mosaics, the empire needed its words. It needed its scrolls, its decrees, its stamped bits of paper saying yes, no, maybe, or please try again in spring. The earliest Ottoman rulers did not inherit a ready-made mail service. They had to build one, or rather, stitch it together from bits of Mongol tradition, Persian infrastructure, and good old-fashioned improvisation. They understood, even in the 14th century, that holding a vast empire together required more than soldiers. It required connection. It required the ability to send a message from Edirne to Aleppo and expect, eventually, that someone would open it, squint at the writing, nod slowly, and then do whatever needed doing. Or at least write back with an excuse. And so, they began. At first, the system was simple. Messengers, known as alak, rode on horseback between key cities, sometimes stopping at caravanserais, those walled roadside inns where travelers and their animals could rest, water, and occasionally be robbed. These stations, spaced every 30 to 50 kilometers or so, served as the backbone of the network. Each one offered a change of mount, a sip of tea, and maybe a bit of gossip. Over time, a more formal structure emerged, with routes, schedules, loosely defined, and scribes who logged the comings and goings of letters like they were rare birds passing through. But formality did not mean speed. The journey of a letter remained a slow, uncertain thing. It might sit in a dusty corner for days, waiting for the next available courier. It might be delayed by snowfall in the Balkans or summer heat in Mesopotamia. It might be carefully packed, forgotten, rediscovered, and finally delivered long after its sender had given up hope and moved on with their life, or in some cases, passed on entirely. And still, people wrote. They folded their parchment, sealed it with care, and handed it off with a trust so absolute it bordered on the absurd. They wrote to complain about taxes, to ask for favors, to announce births, to explain late payments, to send love, to settle scores. They knew, they always knew, that their letter might arrive late, or never. But they wrote anyway, because that was what kept the empire human. In dusty record rooms across former Ottoman territories, archivists today still stumble upon these messages. Some are in Ottoman Turkish, an ornate, looping script that dances across the page like a vine with somewhere to be. Others are in Arabic, Armenian, Greek, Kurdish, or Ladino. Some are legible, others so faint that they disappear under lamplight. But all of them speak to a shared faith in the written word, and in the people, animals, and infrastructure that carried it. There is, in this, a kind of quiet romance. Not the grand, cinematic type, but the slow, domestic romance of persistence. The Ottoman postal system was not designed to impress. It was designed to endure. And it did, for centuries, long enough to bridge cities, families, and generations. Long enough for empires to rise, reign, and crumble, and still leave behind a scroll or two in some forgotten drawer, waiting to be read. So tonight, as you listen, imagine that letter again, the one from Damascus, or maybe Salonika, addressed to someone who may no longer be alive, or perhaps never was. Picture it resting on a cracked wooden table, wax seal intact, waiting. The wind rattles the window shutters. A candle flickers. Someone reaches for the letter, opens it slowly, and begins to read. The ink is faded. The words are patient. And the story, like all stories carried by the wind, begins not with urgency, but with quiet. Long before the first Ottoman courier tucked a folded parchment under his arm and nudged his horse toward the horizon, long before wax seals bearing the Sultan's tugra pressed down onto damp paper, and long before camels trudged across the Anatolian plateau with saddlebags full of bureaucratic dreams, there were messengers. Not in uniforms. Not on salary. And certainly not following anything one might generously call a timetable. But they were there. Moving quietly through history, one slow step at a time. To understand how the Ottoman postal system eventually took shape, one has to start with what came before it, a messy, overlapping, wonderfully inconsistent patchwork of communication methods that stretched back centuries, and which, like many ancient things, worked only slightly better than they should have, and usually only until it rained. In the early medieval Islamic world, long before the Ottomans rose from the Anatolian frontier, the Abbasid Caliphate had already established a rough prototype of a centralized courier service. It was called the Barid, a network of riders and relay stations that stretched from Baghdad all the way to North Africa and parts of Spain. This system was built not to serve the public, but to serve the caliph. The mail, if it could be called that, was not for birthdays or love poems, but for orders, taxes, intelligence reports, and the occasional complaint about a provincial governor spending too much on rugs. The Barid wasn't designed to be fast so much as controlled. Riders were state employees. Letters were often dictated by scribes, transcribed onto scrolls, sealed, and passed along a chain of tightly monitored stations. Each station, or khan, offered fresh mounts and sometimes even local food for the weary messengers, who needed both energy and luck to navigate through deserts, mountain passes, and regional politics. There was always a risk that someone might open the wrong letter, say the wrong thing, or worse, lose the document in a river. Punishments varied. So did the rivers. The Ottomans, emerging centuries later from the ash and dust of the Mongol invasions and the fragmented Seljuk state, did not invent the idea of empire-wide messaging. What they did, slowly and somewhat awkwardly, was absorb it. They borrowed, like all smart empires do. Bits from the Abbasids. Bits from the Byzantines, who had their own imperial messaging systems powered by foot messengers, pigeon posts, and in some cases, sheer hope. And bits from the Mongols, a people who, while better known for arrows and fire, also left behind one of the most terrifyingly efficient communication networks in pre-modern history. The Mongol Yam, as it was called, was a relay system of astounding ambition. Riders galloped between stations spaced roughly 25 miles apart, carrying orders, maps, threats, and royal decrees. The Yam was fast, strict, and heavily policed, a kind of medieval FedEx with consequences. Those caught interfering with a courier could be punished severely, which is putting it mildly. Genghis Khan wasn't known for subtle feedback. While the Ottomans inherited none of the Mongol speed or brutality, they did inherit a basic understanding of how long-distance communication could hold together a sprawling, multicultural empire. So, when Osman I, the dynasty's founder, began gathering land and allies in the late 13th century, the need for messaging was already implied. If you want to collect taxes, maintain alliances, send soldiers, or explain to a rival emir why his favorite bathhouse is now under your jurisdiction, you need letters. You need scribes. And you need someone willing to ride a horse through bad weather with a scroll tied to their waist. At this early stage, however, things were deeply informal. There were no official stations, no departments of postage, and certainly no stamps. A letter might be written on paper, parchment, or whatever was lying around, including, in some cases, repurposed pages from older texts. The ink was often homemade. The handwriting, occasionally artistic. And the delivery method? That depended entirely on who was available. Sometimes it was a merchant on his way to another city, bribed with a few silver coins and a hot meal to take the message along. Other times it was a servant, or a local religious student, or even a member of the sender's own family. In particularly important cases, the sender might hire a guard or two, not just for protection, but also to intimidate the recipient. A letter carried by a man with a sword often landed differently than one handed off by a baker's apprentice. These were the roots of Ottoman communication, flexible, personal, chaotic. And yet, somehow, functional. Messages got where they needed to go, eventually. Of course, they also got lost, misread, misdelivered, or purposefully rerouted by opportunists. But in a world without standardized maps or street names, that wasn't failure. That was just Tuesday. The Ottomans' rise to power in the 14th and 15th centuries coincided with a growing need for regularized, routinized information flow. As their territory expanded, first across Anatolia, then into the Balkans, and later into North Africa and the Middle East, the limitations of this ad hoc system began to show. You can't run an empire on borrowed horses and guesswork forever. Not if you want your orders obeyed before winter. And so, the Ottomans began to standardize. Not all at once, and not particularly neatly, but with the kind of slow, deliberate adjustments that would define their entire imperial character. They began to identify key routes between cities and establish expectations for how long a message should take. They began to assign dedicated couriers, ulakler, men who were trained, or at least conditioned, to ride long distances with reasonable discretion. These couriers were not allowed to read the messages, though some did. Nor were they allowed to tamper with the seals, though a few did that, too. Still, most performed their duties with the kind of resigned professionalism that only comes from knowing the Sultan might be reading over your shoulder. As the system evolved, so too did the messages. What began as royal orders and tax decrees slowly grew to include reports from the provinces, legal disputes, petitions, and even, though rarely, personal correspondence. The Ottomans still didn't offer a public mail service, but they began to acknowledge that not all communication flowed downward from the throne. Sometimes, people needed to send things sideways, from one bureaucrat to another, or from a judge to a scholar, or from one unhappy merchant to another slightly less unhappy one. The Sultan didn't always need to know. But the empire still needed to carry it. It is during this period, roughly from the late 15th to early 16th centuries, that the foundations of what we now think of as the Ottoman postal system were quietly laid. Not with ceremony. Not with grand designs. But with ink, paper, horses, and a few well-placed rest stops. The camel, curiously, would come later, not because the Ottomans didn't have camels, they did, but because much of the early messaging infrastructure was built around terrain where horses simply worked better. It wasn't until the system extended deeper into the Arab world, with its desert landscapes and long, dry roads, that camels began to appear more regularly in the postal workforce. Even then, the idea of using camels to deliver mail was never particularly efficient, only practical. Camels could carry more. They needed less water. They could handle the dust and heat. But they were not fast. No one ever accused a camel of rushing. Which, in hindsight, made them a perfect match for the empire they served. By the time the Ottomans formalized their postal network in the centuries that followed, the system had already absorbed 1,000 quiet habits. A preference for certain routes. A tradition of folding letters in a particular way. A reluctance to send anything too sensitive without a trusted courier. These details, passed down without fanfare, became the cultural DNA of Ottoman communication. And so, before the camels came, before dusty scrolls rode through sun-baked deserts and over mountain passes, there was something quieter, something more human. A willingness to trust. To write. To send a message into the unknown and believe, against all odds, that it might one day return with an answer. It is easy now, in the age of blinking icons and unread badge counters, to laugh at such slowness. But the people of that earlier world were not in a hurry, not because they didn't care, but because they had no illusion of control. Time moved differently then. Messages took the shape of the land. And before there were schedules, there was only distance, and the small, hopeful decision to cross it. There is something strangely intimate about a road, not the kind with painted lines and traffic signs, but the older kind, carved not by machines, but by repetition. By footsteps. Hooves. Wheel ruts. The kind of road that doesn't begin with a map but with a question, how do I get this there? The Ottomans, like so many before them, faced this question daily. Only this was often an official decree, a folded scroll with a wax seal, a complaint about an unruly governor, or a plea from a far-off district asking, somewhat meekly, for more bread. And there might be across snow-capped mountains, sweltering deserts, or lands where the road existed only in theory. And so, slowly, deliberately, and without much ceremony, they began to build their routes. Not roads in the modern sense. The Ottomans weren't in the business of laying cobblestone highways just for the mail, but rather, they built a system of usable paths stitched together by necessity and habit. A web of connections between major cities and administrative hubs, created not by decree but by movement. These routes followed rivers when they could, passed near wells when they had to, and curved gently around mountains when they dared. Often, they weren't roads at all but beaten tracks marked only by the memory of the last man who traveled them. Still, there was a pattern to it. Istanbul, the heart of the empire, naturally served as the central node. From there, routes radiated outward like the spokes of a slow-turning wheel. One line stretched westward into the Balkans, tracing an ancient Roman corridor where the remains of old empire roads still whispered underfoot. Another ran southeast toward Aleppo and Damascus, passing through dusty Anatolian towns with names that sounded like half-remembered lullabies. Yet another wound south along the Mediterranean, then veered east across the Levant and into the Arabian Peninsula. Each of these paths became arteries of the empire, not always efficient, rarely straight, but dependable in the Ottoman sense of the word, which is to say, they usually got there, eventually. At the heart of these routes were the caravanserais, those stone-bellied rest stations that served as the Ottoman equivalent of roadside motels, distribution centers, gossip halls, stables, and sometimes fortresses, all rolled into one. The name itself, from Persian origins meaning caravan palace, is a bit misleading. They were rarely palatial. Most were plain, fortress-like structures with thick walls, a large courtyard in the center, and rows of rooms for travelers, animals, and occasionally, the odd scroll or two waiting for pickup. These inns dotted the empire every 30 to 50 kilometers or so, a distance chosen not by bureaucracy, but by horses. That was, more or less, how far a horse could go before it began to develop strong personal objections. And so, with equine endurance as the guiding metric, the Ottomans plotted their imperial routes. A courier setting out from one city would ride to the next caravanserai, hand off his burden, change horses, drink something vaguely medicinal, and continue. Or, if no fresh courier was available, he might simply rest for a few hours, or days, until someone else came along who was heading in roughly the right direction and looked reasonably literate. This was not an express service. It was a relay race without a stopwatch. The inns themselves were surprisingly lively places, filled not only with mail but with merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and storytellers, all pausing in their journeys, brushing the dust from their cloaks, and exchanging news from other corners of the empire. Letters were sorted in the quiet corners of these courtyards, tied into bundles with string or slipped into the folds of a saddlebag. There was no central sorting facility. No zip codes. Just names, destinations, and the assumption that someone along the way would know where that was. And then there was the weather. The Ottoman routes had to contend with every known atmospheric nuisance the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Europe could invent. Snow in the Balkans. Mud in Anatolia. Blistering sun in the Syrian plains. And of course, sandstorms, those sweeping, stinging tantrums of the desert that could turn a message from visible ink into dusty myth in minutes. A letter might begin its journey neatly folded and dry, and arrive weeks later as a barely legible parchment with the texture of old leather and the scent of camel breath. Sandstorms were a particular menace. Couriers caught in them often had to stop, dismount, and simply wait, sometimes burying themselves and their horses under blankets to avoid inhaling too much of the empire. Some letters were wrapped in multiple layers of cloth for protection. Others weren't so lucky. More than one decree from Istanbul to the Hijaz arrived at its destination looking like it had been gnawed on by fate itself. Despite all this, the wind, the hills, the slow-dying lanterns inside the caravanserais, the system worked. It worked because it had to. Because the routes, for all their flaws, represented the veins of imperial authority. Orders needed to be sent. Taxes needed to be acknowledged. Rebellions needed to be responded to with at least a paragraph and some official seal. And every corner of the Ottoman world, from the snow-capped mountains of Bosnia to the sands of the Arabian Peninsula, knew that their connection to the center, tenuous, slow, and occasionally goat-chewed as it was, came in the form of a letter on the back of a tired horse. Of course, not all destinations were equally served. The core routes between major cities were relatively well maintained. But the more remote a village was, the more it relied on indirect solutions, traveling merchants, religious pilgrims, or friendly imams with good handwriting. Some communities had no regular courier at all, and letters might sit in a caravanserai for months, waiting for a volunteer or for someone to remember they existed. And then there were the accidents. A letter might fall from a saddlebag during a river crossing. Or it might be stolen by bandits who, upon realizing it contained nothing but land tax receipts, used it to start a fire. There were instances of entire mail satchels being lost in floods, eaten by wolves, or, in at least one documented case, simply misplaced under a pile of wool and found again 3 years later, to much bureaucratic confusion. But perhaps the greatest enemy of all was not weather or wildlife, but indifference. Not from the couriers, who were generally proud of their role, even when underpaid, but from the system itself, which had no means of checking whether a letter ever actually arrived. There were no receipts, no proof of delivery. If a message failed to reach its destination, the sender might never know. The empire, in that way, ran on a strange combination of discipline and faith. You sent what you could. You hoped it got there. And if it didn't, you tried again. Eventually. The slow pace of Ottoman communication also gave rise to a certain tone in their writing, one that scholars often describe as formal, roundabout, and heavy on honorifics. When a letter takes 6 weeks to arrive, you don't just get to the point. You don't say, "Please send more ink." You say, "May the light of your pen illuminate the darkness of this humble servant's administrative despair." It is with great hesitation and in full awareness of your most luminous generosity that I dare to report a shortage in the storerooms of liquid black wisdom. This wasn't just stylistic. It was emotional insurance. If your message never arrived, at least you had tried beautifully. Even today, the traces of these routes remain. Some caravanserais still stand, empty now, their courtyards filled with silence and pigeons. Others have been repurposed as shops, museums, or simply allowed to crumble back into the landscape. The roads they once served are often forgotten or paved over, but in the lines of ancient correspondence, you can still feel the rhythm of those old journeys. The gaps. The pauses. The hesitations that come not from the writer's mind, but from the physical space between sender and receiver. In modern maps, these routes are no longer drawn. But in old documents, the kinds tucked in forgotten corners of Ottoman archives, they reappear like ghosts. A notation in the margin, received late, due to rain in Konya. A smudge of ink where the seal melted in heat. A tear in the corner, where some bored official, waiting for a reply, folded and unfolded the letter a few dozen times while watching the door. And so, the roads of the Ottoman postal system were never just geography. They were memory. Habit. A willingness to endure friction, delay, and the odd sandstorm in order to send a message, however small, into the vastness, and trust that someone, somewhere, might read it. That was the route. Not straight. Not fast. But real. Imagine, for a moment, a figure on the horizon. Small at first, swaying slightly with the motion of the animal beneath him. Dust rises in little spirals behind him, barely visible in the afternoon haze. He is not armored. He carries no sword. He is not a merchant, nor a pilgrim, nor a soldier. He is something more mundane and, somehow, more mysterious, a courier. One of the quiet architects of empire. And what he carries, folded neatly, sealed with wax, tucked into a leather pouch, is, for now, the most important document in the Ottoman world. Even if it's just a report on grain storage in Edirne. They were called alak, these men. Riders, messengers, runners between cities and provinces. Their job was not glamorous, and it was rarely safe. But without them, the sprawling Ottoman Empire would have been little more than an idea on a map, impressive in theory, but disconnected in practice. It was the couriers who made the empire real, one letter, one gallop, one dusty afternoon at a time. The life of a courier was a strange mix of routine and uncertainty. Each journey began with instruction, often vague, and a destination that was more of a suggestion than a guarantee. They were told where to go, approximately how long it might take, and what they were carrying. The rest was left to judgment, endurance, and a good sense of direction. There were no GPS coordinates. No traffic updates. Just a map, maybe, and the knowledge passed down from those who had ridden the route before, where to stop for water, which inns were trustworthy, which mountain passes to avoid in early spring. And so they rode. Most traveled on horseback. Horses were, after all, the speediest option available, nimble, fast, and relatively cooperative when not overworked or startled by snakes. A well-trained Ottoman courier could cover vast stretches of land in a single day, switching horses at caravanserais, eating when he could, sleeping only when he must. Time mattered. Not because the letters were always urgent, but because the rhythm of the empire demanded motion. Delay too long, and a governor might act without permission. A soldier might march without orders. A noble might start to feel just a little too independent. So the couriers pressed on. The horses, of course, did most of the work. There were different breeds for different regions. In the Balkans, shaggy, strong-legged animals adapted to hills and mud. In the highlands of Anatolia, leaner, sure-footed mounts that could find their way through rocky terrain. And in the deserts farther south, well, there, horses began to lose their appeal. Which is when the camels came in. A camel is a creature of contradictions. Graceful in silhouette, comically awkward up close. Patient, and yet frequently annoyed. Capable of carrying enormous loads across unforgiving terrain, but absolutely unwilling to be rushed. They do not gallop. They do not dash. They plod. And when they stop for reasons of their own. But in the arid regions of the Ottoman world, Arabia, Egypt, parts of Syria, camels were not just useful. They were essential. It was not uncommon for couriers to switch between horse and camel as their route demanded. This required a certain mental adjustment. You could not ride a camel with the same urgency as a horse. You had to give in to its rhythm, a slow, rolling march that felt less like riding and more like drifting across time. Some couriers loved their camels. Others cursed them. But all respected them, in the way one respects a cantankerous relative who always shows up when it matters. On long desert routes, where caravanserais were fewer and the heat could melt wax right off a seal, camels carried mail pouches in large saddlebags made of leather and thick cloth. These pouches were tied tightly, not just to protect against theft, but against dust, the eternal enemy. Letters had to be wrapped in layers. Scrolls sometimes traveled in carved wooden cases. In certain months, particularly in the dog days of summer, messages were written twice, one for reading, and one to replace the one that would inevitably arrive too smudged to decipher. Not every courier worked alone. In more remote regions, they traveled in pairs, or as part of small caravans. Some were accompanied by guards, especially when passing through territories known for banditry. Others rode with merchants, slipping their letters into crates of spices or bolts of silk. A few high-ranking messengers had their own escorts, not because they were important, but because what they carried was. If a scroll bore the tugra, the imperial calligraphic signature of the Sultan, it could not, under any circumstances, be lost. Of course, things were sometimes lost. A courier could be thrown from his horse and break a leg. He could be waylaid by rebels, or arrested by suspicious local officials, or simply disappear into the wilderness. It happened. When it did, the imperial court rarely blamed the letter. Instead, they blamed the route, the weather, or occasionally, fate. The Ottomans were practical that way. They believed in systems, but also in misfortune. And still, the couriers rode. Their uniforms, if they had any, were simple, practical clothing suited to the terrain, often layered for warmth or protection from sand. They carried food when they could, but more often relied on the hospitality of inns and strangers. Their names are rarely recorded. Most are footnotes in court documents, mentioned only when something went wrong. And yet, their work stitched the empire together like thread through a vast and complicated fabric. Some became legends in their own quiet way. A courier who rode from Aleppo to Istanbul in less than 10 days, an impressive feat, considering the terrain. Another who survived a sandstorm by burying himself and his letter pouch under a collapsed tent for 3 days. A third who, unable to find a recipient in Damascus, waited for 2 weeks outside the city gate, living on figs and stale bread, until the man finally returned from a hunting trip. These stories were passed from one rider to the next. Not written down, but remembered, told over meals, in the quiet corners of caravanserais, in the silence between journeys. They did not brag. They did not seek fame. But among couriers, reputation mattered. A man who could be trusted to deliver a letter intact, on time, and unopened, that was someone worth knowing. And yet, the couriers were not immune to temptation. Some read what they carried. Others made copies. A few even added their own notes, helpful suggestions, updates, warnings. Most did not. There was a code of honor, unspoken but widely understood: you do not tamper with a seal. Not just because it was illegal, but because it was bad luck. Letters were not just paper. They were burdens. To carry one was to step briefly into someone else's story. And that required respect. In time, as the Ottoman state grew more bureaucratic, courier routes became more regular. Positions were formalized. Some couriers were hired full-time by the central government. Others worked under provincial governors. Wages were inconsistent. Benefits non-existent. But for many, the job was not about money. It was about purpose. About movement. About the strange, quiet satisfaction of delivering something, however small, to where it was meant to go. They rarely received thanks. No one threw a banquet when a scroll arrived on time. But occasionally, a letter would be accompanied by a second pouch, a small parcel of figs, a coin, a folded piece of cloth. Gifts, not bribes. A way of saying, I know what you do matters. Today, their names are mostly lost. Their horses long gone. Their saddlebags turned to dust. But their paths remain, not in the roads, but in the documents. In the letters that reached their destinations. In the notes scribbled in the margins. In the quiet lines that begin, to the most honorable, and end with a name written in ink still legible centuries later. The couriers, whether on horseback, camelback, or tired foot, were the messengers of an empire that refused to rush. They moved with the pace of trust, of terrain, of history. And in their dusty trails, across mountains and deserts, they left behind something more enduring than speed. They left connection. In a world where messages moved no faster than hooves or sand-worn feet, and where each letter's journey was marked not by minutes but by weather, geography, and the temperament of a camel, the Ottoman Empire still understood one thing above all else: information was power. And like all good empires, it preferred that power be centralized. Very centralized. Specifically, in the hands of one man, the Sultan. This wasn't about curiosity. It was about control. The idea that a letter, even a humble one about local tax collection or a request for road repair, might contain a fragment of disloyalty or hint of discontent was not a paranoid delusion. It was policy. Because to rule an empire that stretched from the stormy forests of Hungary to the sandy breadth of the Red Sea, an empire so vast it could be morning in one province and nearly night in another, you needed to know not just what your subjects were doing, but what they were thinking. Or, more accurately, writing. And so, long before your letter reached its intended reader, there was a good chance it would pass through someone else's hands first. Not the courier. Not the innkeeper at the caravanserai. But a quiet figure in a cool room behind a closed door, usually near the palace, usually working late, and almost always surrounded by piles of paper. This was the domain of the Divan-i Humayun, the imperial council. And within it, certain scribes and officials had the special, unsung duty of examining correspondence. Not in public. Not officially. Just carefully. And sometimes repeatedly. When a letter arrived in Istanbul from the provinces, especially if it came from a governor, a judge, a regional commander, or anyone of middling ambition, it was not delivered directly to the recipient. It was opened, read, transcribed, and summarized. The original might be resealed and sent on. Or, in more sensitive cases, withheld entirely. Replies could be delayed, revised, or redirected. Sometimes the sender received no reply at all, and the silence itself became the answer. The reasoning was simple: the Sultan had to know first. This practice, though rarely acknowledged out loud, was understood throughout the empire. It shaped the tone of letters, flowery, respectful, endlessly deferential. No one wanted to risk offending the first eyes to see their words. Letters addressed to the Sultan himself, or to the Grand Vizier, were often double-wrapped, with outer messages of loyalty and inner layers of substance, like an onion of obedience. Complaints were written like compliments. Criticism disguised as confusion. Urgency softened into mild suggestion. A typical letter from a provincial governor might begin with something like, "May the wisdom of your imperial majesty shine across the world like the morning sun upon dew-covered tulips. I write not out of complaint, heaven forbid, but merely to share a trifling observation which your infinite grace might already have considered," and only then, for paragraphs later, might he mention that two towns have erupted into open conflict over a canal dispute. Even personal letters, rare though they were, could be intercepted if they passed through official routes. This discouraged most citizens from using the imperial postal system for anything private. Not that they had access to it, strictly speaking. But even those within the bureaucracy learned to write with a second reader in mind. Every sentence might have two meanings, one for the recipient, and one for the gatekeeper. There were, of course, exceptions. Some letters were coded. Some were delivered by trusted servants or smuggled in the folds of clothing. Lovers, rebels, merchants, and even scholars devised their own informal networks, slower, less reliable, but safer from prying eyes. Still, these systems were risky, and failure could mean more than inconvenience. A letter intercepted out of context might be misunderstood, or understood all too well. And if the message carried a genuine threat, an accusation, a plot, a whisper of rebellion, it didn't just go to a scribe. It went straight to the Mutafarica, the palace intelligence service. These men operated in shadows, but their presence was well known. They kept lists. Lists of names. Lists of letters. Lists of provinces where complaints arrived too frequently or used suspiciously similar phrases. The Empire, you see, read between the lines. A sharp-eyed reader could detect dissent in tone. A delayed report might be evidence of confusion. A request for more soldiers might actually be a warning, or a threat. A message too perfect, too flattering, too eager could be a mask for disloyalty. In the Ottoman court, as in most courts, paranoia was considered prudence with a good vocabulary. And so, many letters were copied and stored. Sometimes they were annotated in the margins by scribes with impeccable calligraphy and quiet opinions. Sometimes they were filed away for months or years, just in case. The empire kept archives, and the archives kept secrets. There are letters in those collections still unread, still folded just as they arrived, their seals unbroken, their words frozen in time. Historians stumble upon them now and then, like messages from ghosts. Of course, not all control was sinister. Some of it was simply structural. By reviewing correspondence first, the Sultan and his advisors could coordinate policy. If a provincial official wrote to multiple departments, seeking funds from one, permission from another, and praise from a third, the center could harmonize the response. It avoided contradictions. It preserved appearances. It gave the illusion of imperial consensus, even when the truth was more like imperial improvisation. But control could also breed distance. The more the empire filtered and inspected its own communications, the more it lost the human texture of its far-flung provinces. The voices that reached the court were curated. Sanitized. Sometimes censored. Reports of famine might be softened into food shortages. Descriptions of unrest edited into misunderstandings. The Sultan ruled not from experience, but from paperwork. And yet, the system endured. It endured because it reflected something deeply Ottoman, a distrust of chaos paired with an acceptance of imperfection. The empire knew it could not hear every voice. So it chose which ones to listen to, and which to ignore. It read what it could. Skimmed what it must. And if a letter threatened the balance, it might be read again. And again. And again. There were moments, rare but real, when the system broke down. When letters arrived too late. When messages were deliberately altered. When entire satchels were lost in rivers or claimed by fire. In such moments, the empire learned through silence. And silence, too, could speak volumes. The sultans themselves were not always the direct readers. They had secretaries, viziers, court historians, and advisors who did most of the work. But the idea remained: before the people were informed, the palace must be. The first reader was not always the intended one. But he was the most powerful. This culture of first reading shaped the Ottoman imagination. It fostered caution. It encouraged bureaucracy. It rewarded those who could say everything and nothing at once. Even poetry, in its own way, reflected this: layers of meaning, veils over veils. A good poem, like a good letter, could say the dangerous thing quietly enough to be missed, or loudly enough to be mistaken for praise. There is something strangely beautiful in this tension. The way letters had to bend themselves into civility. The way writers learned to dance with language, to suggest instead of state, to ask by way of admiration. A people who mastered this form of writing were not simply passive subjects. They were co-authors of empire. Today, we might view such systems as intrusive, or even oppressive. And in many ways, they were. But they were also reflections of a world that understood the weight of words. In an empire where every message had to earn its passage, through heat, rain, fatigue, and suspicion, a sentence became sacred. And so the empire read. Carefully. Quietly. First. And the scribe, in his cool little room behind the lattice window, dipped his pen once more into ink, turned the parchment in the candlelight and began to read, not for meaning, but for intent. Not for grammar, but for danger. Because before a letter could be delivered, it had to be understood. And before it could be understood, it had to be watched. So the Sultan read first. It is a quiet morning in a quiet Ottoman village. The sun is still gentle, not yet harsh. Chickens peck lazily at the dust, a dog yawns in the shade, and somewhere in the distance, a vendor half-heartedly announces something about watermelons. In a corner of this sleepy place, an old man with a thin mustache and a clean shirt is standing by the side of the road, holding a folded piece of paper. He is waiting. Waiting for someone who will not come. Because, in the Ottoman Empire, unless you were part of the government, the clergy, the military, or a merchant wealthy enough to hire your own courier, you didn't get mail. There was no letter for the blacksmith, even if his brother moved to Damascus. No birthday greetings for the weaver's daughter who married into a family 2 towns over. No love notes for the lonely baker. The imperial postal system, as far as the common people were concerned, might as well have been magic, invisible, mysterious, and entirely out of reach. This was not out of cruelty. Not exactly. It was out of purpose. The Ottoman postal infrastructure, from its inception, was a tool of administration. It was built to carry commands, reports, decrees, tax assessments, and court documents. It served the state, and the state, like many large, complicated things, did not see much reason to carry letters between 2 shepherds discussing lamb prices. The idea of public mail, as we now understand it, simply didn't exist. There were no post offices with little windows and impatient clerks. No drop boxes. No stamps. No guarantees. There was, instead, a system that knew exactly what it was for: governance. If you were a pasha, a judge, a regional treasurer, or anyone employed in the bureaucratic machinery of the empire, your words had wings. If not, well, perhaps your words could walk. And so, for the vast majority of Ottoman subjects, peasants, artisans, small-scale traders, and the ordinary folk of towns and villages, sending a letter meant improvisation. Sometimes, if you were lucky, a traveling merchant from your region was heading in the right direction. You might press a letter into his hands with a coin or 2 and a quiet hope. Or you might ask a visiting imam, or a scholar, or a Sufi dervish, or anyone who looked literate and less likely to lose their shoes. The most important quality in a messenger wasn't speed. It was memory, the ability to remember who the letter was for, what town they lived in, and what their father's name was. Street names were a luxury. Landmarks were better. "He lives near the fig tree behind the mosque" was usually more effective than any formal address. Sometimes people didn't even write. They sent messages by word of mouth, careful, memorized scripts passed between travelers like folded secrets. "Tell my Uncle Ollie that the barley harvest was poor, and that my son's leg is healing well." The traveler would nod, repeat the message back to confirm, then tuck it away in his mind like a prayer bead. Sometimes it arrived whole. Sometimes it arrived with small errors. Sometimes it never arrived at all. This was not a failure. It was simply life. The literacy rate in the Ottoman Empire, particularly among rural populations, was low. Writing was a skill reserved for the educated, the religious, the professional classes. Most villagers didn't write because they couldn't. But even if they could, paper was expensive, ink difficult to come by, and good pens even rarer. Writing was sacred, not in the poetic sense, but in the practical one. You didn't write unless it mattered. And if it did matter, you usually found someone to write it for you. There were scribes, after all. In many towns, especially larger ones, you could pay a professional letter writer, often a schoolteacher or a mosque scribe, to compose a letter on your behalf. These men were masters of formula and flattery. They knew how to open a letter with the proper blessings, how to insert the emotional weight in just the right place, and how to close it with sufficient reverence, regardless of whether you were writing to your cousin or your creditor. The scribe would dip his pen, write slowly, speaking the words aloud as he worked, and then read the letter back to you. If you approved, he would seal it and help you find a way to send it. Sometimes he also wrote the reply when it came back, assuming it ever did. But not all villages had scribes. And not all messages were worth the price. So many messages were simply never sent. Words stayed where they were born, passed in person, whispered over shared tea, or buried quietly beneath the day's other tasks. In this way, the common people lived in a world where most thoughts remained local, most concerns shared with neighbors, and most news arrived long after it stopped being news. And yet, the absence of mail did not mean the absence of communication. The empire was threaded with human networks that moved faster than any official courier: traders, pilgrims, entertainers, itinerant healers, Sufi mystics, wandering poets, storytellers, and gossip-bearing grandmothers with married daughters in 3 different provinces. These people carried not letters, but stories. They spread births, deaths, marriages, prices, rumors, and the occasional political joke, the latter always told in a very quiet voice. News traveled by people. And while a letter could be lost, a story could not. It morphed. It bent. It picked up flourishes, grew new endings, lost its original date. But it endured. Still, there were moments, quiet, personal moments, when people longed for letters. A mother who hadn't seen her son in 5 years. A wife whose husband had taken work in a distant city. A brother who moved to Cairo and never returned. The empire was wide, and migration was common. But separation hurt. And in those spaces, letters became more than ink. They became presents. Which is why, when a letter did arrive, a real letter, folded and sealed and bearing a known hand, it was treated like a relic. It was read aloud, slowly. Passed from hand to hand. Sometimes placed in a drawer lined with cloth. A letter from a loved one was not news. It was a visitation. But these moments were rare. For the vast majority, silence was the norm. People adjusted to it. They found other ways to remember each other: prayers, songs, objects left behind. A shawl. A tool. A recipe. Something to tie them to the absent. And while the imperial postal system rumbled on, camels carrying grain reports, horses delivering orders, couriers sweating through bureaucratic pronouncements, the people below it lived in a different rhythm. One of waiting. Wondering. Accepting. It's easy now to romanticize this quiet world. But it had its hardships. A man could die and his family might not learn of it for months. A birth could go uncelebrated. A promise might linger unanswered until it turned into doubt. In a world without reliable mail, love required patience. So did business. So did grief. The empire, for all its grandeur, offered little to those who lived in its shadows. But then again, perhaps it was precisely because of this absence that words, when they came, mattered more. A letter was never routine. It was never junk. It was never read distractedly while eating lunch. It was a deliberate act. A chosen thing. A rare, slow arrival that reminded people they had not been forgotten. Eventually, in the 19th century, reforms would come. The Tanzimat era brought with it modernizing impulses, railways, centralized law codes, telegraphs, and yes, even the early signs of a public mail service. For the first time, ordinary citizens were given the chance to send and receive letters through official channels. Postal offices appeared in cities and larger towns. Stamps were introduced. The empire opened a small window in its wall. But even then, change was slow. Access remained uneven. In many villages, the old habits lingered. Letters were still sent by hand. News still traveled by word of mouth. And most people still measured distance not in kilometers, but in how many seasons it had been since someone wrote. In the end, the common folk of the Ottoman Empire lived without a postal system, but not without communication. They made do with what they had: memory, voice, trust. They didn't write often, but when they did, it meant something. And when a letter arrived, it wasn't just paper. It was a miracle. So, the old man in the village. The one waiting by the road with a folded paper in hand. He knows no courier is coming. But he waits anyway. Just in case. If one were to design an ideal postal system, one where letters arrived swiftly, predictably, and intact, one might begin with a few basic rules: straight roads, reliable messengers, calm weather, cooperative terrain, and a general absence of war, famine, or unusually aggressive goats. The Ottoman Empire, it should be said, had almost none of these things. What it had, instead, was geography. Lots of it. Mountains that sulked beneath snow half the year. Deserts that whispered sand into the very marrow of your bones. Forests where wolves were less of a threat than mud. And rivers that flooded on Tuesdays, froze on Thursdays, and swallowed messages with alarming enthusiasm. It had seasons that didn't care about timetables, roads that vanished in storms, and towns that seemed to shift location whenever someone tried to map them. And through all of it, the letters marched. Slowly. Uncertainly. With the resigned optimism of people who had come to expect the worst and learned, somehow, to keep moving anyway. Delays were not just common, they were practically built into the system. A letter sent from one end of the empire to another could take weeks or even months to arrive. That was if nothing went wrong. If everything went perfectly, the ink might still be dry by the time the seal was broken. But this was rare. The more typical scenario involved smudges, second-hand corrections, a new outer wrapping because the old one had disintegrated, and, quite often, a note apologizing for the condition of the message and the time it took to arrive. Disasters came in all forms. The simplest was the weather. A sudden snowstorm in the Balkans could trap couriers in mountain inns for days. A flood might wash away a bridge, turning a 3-day journey into a 3-week detour. In the desert, sandstorms rose without warning, scouring skin, fabric, and parchment alike. Letters had to be wrapped tightly, sometimes double or triple folded with oiled cloth to resist the grit. Even then, entire satchels were known to arrive looking like they'd been stored inside a flour sack during a stampede. And then there were the animals. A courier might lose his horse to a broken leg or a stolen saddle. Camels, famously unhurried, could simply refuse to proceed. One courier's account tells of a stubborn dromedary that sat down in the middle of the road near Aleppo and refused to move for 2 days. Attempts to coax it with dates, sweet water, flattery, and eventually loud insults failed entirely. The camel moved only when a passing caravan included one of its former handlers, who whispered something to it in Armenian, and it stood up immediately, offended. Then there were wolves, bears, bandits, angry farmers, and, on one particularly memorable occasion, a plague of locusts that did not eat letters, but did frighten enough horses to scatter an entire postal convoy across the plains of Anatolia. Sometimes the disasters weren't external, but logistical. In the bureaucracy of empire, a single misplaced document could cause a ripple effect that lasted months. A letter might be delivered to the wrong person, or the right person on the wrong day. A scroll addressed to a governor might end up in the hands of his cousin with the same name, who also happened to be visiting from a different province. By the time the mistake was realized, the letter had already been answered, forwarded, or used to wrap a very small fish. Scribes were not immune to error. A forgotten word could change the tone of a message from request to reprimand. A miscopied date could throw entire grain shipments into chaos. An extra flourish on a name might make the recipient appear to be someone else entirely, prompting either undue flattery or unexpected punishment. And yet, the most common form of disaster was simply forgetting. A letter left in a pouch at the bottom of a saddlebag. A courier who mistook one route for another. A document left behind at a caravanserai, where it sat for weeks beneath a bench before being rediscovered by a curious goat. Some messages simply disappeared. No explanation. No wreckage. No eyewitnesses. They left no trace except the gap they created, the silence where a response should have been. A governor waits for orders. A commander hesitates to move troops. A family never hears news of a distant birth. Somewhere, a scroll curls gently in the wind behind a rock, unread. And what did the empire do in the face of all this? It shrugged. Not out of indifference, but out of deep familiarity. Everyone in the system, from scribes to viziers, knew that delays were part of the process. Letters were sent with a kind of emotional cushion already built in. Replies were expected weeks late. Urgency was a relative concept. Even orders marked as immediate often included a polite clause that read, essentially, should the Lord of Circumstances permit. People adapted. Governors made contingency plans. Commanders relied on local judgment. Merchants hedged their agreements. And common folk, if they sent letters at all, learned to wait with patience that bordered on the philosophical. But sometimes, delay was deliberate. A courier might pause for a day to avoid dangerous terrain. A scribe might hold a message for review, suspecting political implications. A local official, wary of bad news, might simply choose not to forward a letter. It never arrived, he might say, with a face carved from innocence. Who could prove otherwise? The lack of receipts, signatures, or official tracking meant the postal system operated on trust, a trust that could be manipulated. And in the quieter corners of the empire, where oversight was thin and motives were muddy, letters became tools in local games of power, delay, or denial. Still, for every lost message, there were others that survived the chaos. Letters that traveled across deserts, up mountains, and through the snows of Armenia. Letters that passed through 5 sets of hands and still reached their destination. Letters that were read aloud in candlelit rooms, their ink faded but their meaning intact. Messages that arrived just in time to prevent a disaster, secure a treaty, or reassure a worried family. And these successes, these small triumphs over nature, time, and dust, gave the system its strength. Not because it was perfect, but because it kept going anyway. Perhaps that is the most Ottoman part of it all. The understanding that perfection was never the goal, only persistence. In the imperial imagination, the delays, disasters, and dust were not failures. They were part of the landscape. The same way a mountain road would be slower than a coastal one. The same way winter always made things harder. The same way a camel would sometimes sit down and refuse to discuss the matter further. And so, the empire moved. Letters staggered forward. Routes adjusted. New scribes replaced the old. Messages were rewritten. Seals were reapplied. And always, somewhere, a man in dusty boots was trying to deliver something folded and fragile. He might arrive late. He probably would. But when he did, when the seal was broken and the message read, the delay would be forgiven. Because in the Ottoman world, to arrive at all was already a kind of miracle. It happened quietly, as such things tend to do. One morning, in a dusty street of Constantinople, now beginning to be called Istanbul more often than not, a wooden box appeared. It stood upright, painted in dark color, with a narrow slit in the middle and the faint shimmer of brass hinges. It was not a shrine. It was not a trash bin. It was, in fact, the future. More precisely, it was a mailbox. For centuries, the Ottoman postal system had functioned like a slow, breathing creature, adapting, surviving, wandering across mountains and deserts at the speed of weather and animal will. But by the mid-19th century, the world outside was moving faster. Too fast, perhaps. Trains were roaring through Europe. Steamships were shrinking oceans. Telegraph wires were humming with silent electricity. And empires, even ones with a long tradition of taking their time, began to feel pressure. The Ottoman state had reached that strange and delicate stage of empirehood where grandeur lingers, but gravity pulls. Diplomats returned from London and Paris with stories of public mailboxes, postmen in uniform, and machines that could send a message from one city to another in minutes, using nothing more than sparks and coded clicks. It was, understandably, unsettling. And so, reforms began. Not quickly. Not with fanfare. But with that same Ottoman rhythm, deliberate, cautious, slightly overdue. The reform era known as Tanzimat, which began officially in 1839, aimed to reshape many aspects of the empire: law, education, taxation, military organization, and nestled within this grand program of renewal, like a folded letter inside a drawer, was the quiet decision to rethink how mail worked. For the first time, the state began to entertain the idea that mail could be for the people. Not just for viziers and governors. Not just for orders and taxes. But for shopkeepers. For students. For tailors and imams and, eventually, for anyone who had something to say and nowhere to ride. It started with structure. A new Ministry of Post was formed, not yet sleek or efficient, but a step up from the patchwork of scribes and runners that had served until then. Central offices were established in major cities, beginning with Istanbul, then spreading slowly to provincial capitals. The empire was divided into administrative postal regions. Routes were redrawn. Schedules, once poetic suggestions, were turned into charts and tables. Letters were now expected to arrive not someday, but within a certain number of days, a terrifying concept to those raised in the traditions of endless delay. Then came the uniforms. Postmen, once invisible men on horses or hired hands with dusty boots, were now given coats. Buttons. Caps. Bags with straps. Their appearance was meant to convey order and trust, but in many places, it simply confused people. In some rural towns, villagers mistook them for soldiers. In others, they were thought to be tax collectors in disguise. It took time for the idea to settle that a man could knock on your door and hand you something other than a demand. Soon after, the empire introduced postage stamps. Small, colorful, rectangular emblems that looked suspiciously like pieces of art you weren't allowed to hang. The first official Ottoman stamp appeared in the 1860s. It featured elaborate calligraphy and was, to many eyes, almost too beautiful to be spent. People collected them without sending anything, or stuck them to documents that never moved. Some tried to reuse them. Others tried to eat them, not out of malice, but out of sincere confusion. And then, quietly, the mailbox arrived. Placed at central squares, near mosques, outside schools and post offices, the mailbox represented a strange shift in thinking. It was no longer the courier who carried the message. Now the letter began its journey with you, your hand, your decision, your walk to a wooden box under the gaze of curious neighbors. Dropping a letter inside felt ceremonial. Final. Like letting go of a small bird and hoping it knew where to fly. To encourage usage, pamphlets were printed, describing how to write an address, how much postage to affix, how long delivery might take. These guides were written in Ottoman Turkish, of course, but also translated into Arabic, Armenian, Greek, and French, a nod to the empire's kaleidoscope of languages and the ever-watchful eyes of European consulates. Still, habits change slowly. Many people continued to send letters by hand. They trusted the familiar, the local shopkeeper making a delivery to another town, the cousin visiting from afar. The idea that a government official, one you didn't know personally, would carry your private words, was hard to digest. And besides, literacy still hovered below comfort levels. Writing a letter meant asking someone to write it for you, and now also to explain what a stamp was, how to address it, and whether licking it was a sin. But some embraced it. Young clerks sent notes to one another across the city, delighted to receive a reply the next day. Lovers wrote cautiously worded letters disguised as business transactions. Merchants tested the system with invoices and inventories. In time, a rhythm emerged. Postcards appeared. Newspapers listed delivery schedules. Certain districts even developed reputations for efficiency, though efficient still meant a delivery time of somewhere between 3 and 10 days, depending on the mood of the horse or the size of the mud. Meanwhile, the empire opened its first international postal agreements. This meant that a letter from Izmir could now, in theory, reach Vienna or Marseille without being handed off to a ship captain with excellent memory. The Ottoman postal system joined the Universal Postal Union in the 1870s, marking its entry into a worldwide network, a quiet but profound act of diplomacy written in ink, not steel. Of course, not everything modernized smoothly. Some mailboxes were vandalized. Others were used to store fruit or as shelters for stray cats. There were rumors that certain boxes led to nowhere, that letters dropped in them simply vanished. A few postmen quit, declaring the job to be too suspicious. But others stayed, and a new generation emerged, one raised not on scrolls and seals, but on envelopes and timetables. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman postal system had become almost respectable. A network of trains, steamships, and stagecoaches carried letters across the empire with something resembling consistency. Major cities had central post offices, each with rows of pigeonholes and clerks armed with rubber stamps and weary expressions. People queued for stamps. They sent registered mail. They tracked packages. They complained about delays. It was modernity, Ottoman style. But even in this new age, echoes of the old remained. In rural areas, letters were still handed to shopkeepers. Some post offices operated from the back rooms of cafes or mosques. In remote provinces, mail arrived on muleback or by boat, weather permitting. And in some homes, a letter still carried the weight of a miracle, the same hushed reverence, the same ceremony of opening, the same folding and refolding of the paper until it wore thin with love. And perhaps, despite all the reforms and modernizations, that was the real heart of the system, not the mailboxes, not the uniforms, not even the stamps, but the idea that a message could begin in one hand and, with time and trust, arrive in another. It took centuries for the Ottoman Empire to build such a system. And when it finally did, the world was already changing again, faster, louder, less forgiving. Telegraphs tapped. Telephones rang. Airplanes hummed. Letters became slower not because they were slower, but because everything else had become impossibly fast. Still, for a brief, quiet moment in the empire's long twilight, the mail worked. Not perfectly. Not always promptly. But it worked. It did not end all at once. Most endings don't. Especially not the endings of things built slowly, stubbornly, across centuries. No, the Ottoman postal system did not collapse. It faded. Folded into itself like a worn letter left out too long in the sun. The kind of letter that, when opened, still holds words, but speaks them more faintly than before. It began with the click. Not a loud sound. Just a soft, metallic clicking, precise, coded, quick. The first telegraph lines were laid across Ottoman soil in the mid-19th century, connecting Istanbul to Edirne, then slowly threading their way outward like veins. The clicks were not words, not in the ordinary sense. They were pulses of urgency, traveling faster than any horse or camel could dream. A message that once took 2 weeks to arrive could now arrive in 2 minutes, compressed into dots and dashes, translated by pale men in waistcoats with ink-stained cuffs and exhausted eyes. It felt like a miracle. Or a betrayal. Depending on who you asked. To the statesmen of the Ottoman court, those increasingly anxious men in tall fezzes and stiff collars, the telegraph was salvation. It promised order. Control. Speed. And in an empire beginning to wobble under the weight of modern pressures, it was hard to say no to speed. Provinces that once took months to communicate with could now be reached by wire. Reports of uprisings, famine, or diplomatic visits arrived in real time. The empire could respond. Quickly. Decisively. Or at least give the appearance of it. But to the old couriers, the writers and scribes who had spent lifetimes on the road, the telegraph was something else. An insult, perhaps. Or worse, a shrug. A message without a journey. A sentence without a soul. They watched, quietly, as their routes were shortened. As letters stopped coming. As caravanserais emptied. Horses were sold. Saddlebags were hung on hooks and forgotten. The great relay system, so lovingly if not always efficiently built, began to flicker, piece by piece, into silence. It wasn't immediate. For many years, letters still had their place. The telegraph was reserved for the urgent, the official, the terse. Send troops. Confirm shipment. Sultan ill. But letters still carried emotion. Nuance. The messy, meandering loops of handwriting that let one linger, pause, revise. Still, things were changing. By the late 19th century, even the tone of letters had shifted. What had once been scrolls of poetic formality became envelopes filled with shorter, crisper sentences. There were still flourishes, old habits die slowly, but the letters began to feel aware of their own obsolescence. They apologized more. Forgive the delay. If this reaches you at all, they began to sound like passengers on the last train, tipping their hats to the conductor with quiet dignity. The government tried to keep both systems running, the wires and the letters, but wires were faster. Cheaper. More seductive. And foreign powers, with their cables and networks and shiny machines, made sure the Ottomans knew it. Outside the palace walls, the world was speeding up. Trains were slicing through Anatolia. Steamships arrived in ports like clockwork. Telegraph stations, once rare, began appearing in even modest towns. Men gathered at these stations the way they once gathered at the Friday market, whispering about what had come in, who had sent what, whether the rumor was true. The telegram became not just a tool of administration, but a new kind of social signal. It was modern. It was direct. It was, above all else, fast. And speed, for better or worse, had become the new virtue. But speed, of course, changes things. A telegram could not carry a poem. It could barely carry a mood. It did not wander. It did not pause. It did not apologize. It simply delivered. Quickly. Coldly. One clerk transcribed. Another transmitted. Another decoded. No horses. No sweat. No delays. And no fingerprints of the sender, save the name at the end. For all its efficiency, the telegram lacked something. The quiet. A letter, after all, is a conversation with silence. You write, then wait. The time between becomes part of the message. It gives the words space to breathe. A telegram, by contrast, was a hammer on the chest. Come at once. Mother died. War declared. Even good news felt blunt. Son born. Debt paid. Land secured. The medium did not allow for softness. And so, as telegrams rose, letters began their long goodbye. It wasn't sudden. People still wrote. Some clung to letters out of sentiment. Others simply couldn't afford the telegraph fee, which was often steep. And in rural areas, where wires had not yet reached, letters remained the only option. But the mood had shifted. The age of waiting was ending. The postal system, that creaking, faithful old machinery of writers, stamps, sorters, and sacks, still functioned. Just more quietly. Post offices still opened. Mail still moved. But fewer eyes looked toward the horizon for the courier. Fewer hands reached for the inkpot. A kind of loneliness crept into the act of writing, as if one knew, deep down, that the reply might arrive in a different form. Shorter. Harder. Or not at all. And then came war. The early 20th century brought conflicts that did not move at the speed of letters. Troop movements, supply chains, and diplomatic panics demanded instant communication. Wires were strung faster than bridges could be built. Entire battalions depended on telegrams. In such an environment, the letter was too slow, too delicate. It could still deliver grief. But it could no longer deliver command. In the final years of the Ottoman Empire, letters became artifacts of a fading world. The language of correspondence, once a swirling, calligraphic art form, grew stiffer, simpler, even desperate. Many letters became farewells. From soldiers to mothers. From lovers to each other. From officials to the bureaucracy itself, which no longer had time to respond. And when the empire finally unraveled, in stages, with hesitations and tragedies, its mailboxes remained. Some stood empty. Others were repurposed. A few became bins. One was used as a nesting place for birds. No longer receiving letters, they began to receive rain. The end, when it came, was quiet. A final letter. A final route. A final courier who, perhaps unknowingly, delivered the last piece of mail before the office closed, the horses were sold, and the inkpots were emptied. But even in its twilight, the Ottoman postal system left something behind. Not infrastructure. Much of that faded. Not institutions. They were rebranded, replaced, or removed. What remained, what lingers still, is the idea that words have weight. That distance can be crossed by trust. That a letter is not just paper, but presence. That even when the system is slow, or broken, or buried under bureaucracy, someone somewhere will still write. Still send. Still hope. In the archives of former Ottoman lands, in Istanbul, Damascus, Cairo, Sarajevo, letters rest in boxes, waiting. Some have been read. Others remain folded. The ink is faded. The seals cracked. But the voices inside still speak. Not urgently. Not loudly. But patiently. As if they know that history moves in circles, and that one day, someone will open them and listen. So if you find such a letter, in a museum, an archive, a forgotten drawer, read it slowly. Let the silence between the lines breathe. And remember that once, in a world of camels, couriers, and dust, someone wrote these words and sent them into the unknown. Not knowing when they would arrive. Only that they should. It begins, always, with the sound of a pen. Not the scratch of urgency or the hurried scribble of modern life, but a careful, deliberate stroke, the sound of someone choosing their words with the knowledge that they might be carried for miles, for weeks, through wind and dust and delay. Ink drawn across parchment. A breath between sentences. A pause before folding. The journey of a letter, in the old Ottoman world, was never just about distance. It was about intention. A decision to reach out. To name something. To hold a thought still long enough that it could be passed, hand to hand, across a vast empire that stretched from the green valleys of the Balkans to the red dunes of the Arabian desert. It was, in a sense, an act of faith. Because the moment a letter was sealed, it left your hands and entered another world, a world of roads and rest stops, of hooves and hesitation, of sandstorms and sealed saddlebags. And still, people wrote. They wrote with no promise of reply. With no tracking number. With no certainty beyond the hope that someone, somewhere, might one day break the wax, unfold the page, and hear their voice across the silence of time. In this way, letters were both fragile and invincible. They could be lost, of course. Torn. Smudged. Misdelivered. Forgotten at the bottom of a courier's bag or caught in a downpour somewhere near Konya. And yet, some survived, against all odds, against the indifference of geography and the stubbornness of animals and the shifting whims of war and weather. And when they did arrive, they arrived not as information, but as presence. A folded page, still carrying the warmth of a hand long gone. This was the true gift of the Ottoman postal system. Not efficiency. Not speed. But continuity. It held the empire together, not with speed, but with rhythm. A slow, dependable pulse that carried ideas, orders, memories, and regrets across a land so vast it often forgot itself. It was a system built on the assumption that things would take time, and that this was not only acceptable, but appropriate. Because time, in the Ottoman imagination, was not a straight line. It was a circle. A season. A return. And so the postal system moved accordingly, patiently, persistently, like a river that may not rush, but still arrives. There is a kind of grace in slowness. The modern world often forgets this. Today we value immediacy. We send messages not across land, but across fiber and air. We expect replies not tomorrow, but now. A delay of minutes feels offensive. We abbreviate. We edit mid-sentence. We delete without ever having held the words in our hands. But the Ottomans, for all their bureaucracy and pomp, for all their labyrinthine titles and formal scripts, knew something else. They knew that a letter could live. That it could breathe. That it could wait. And perhaps, in the quiet journey of a folded page, there was something more powerful than any telegram, more enduring than any wire, the belief that words, once written, matter. That they deserve the dignity of space and the patience of time. Even now, in dusty archives and brittle collections, those words remain. A message from a judge to a governor, dated 1673, apologizing for the lateness of a report due to rains, illness, and the unexpected stubbornness of an otherwise faithful mule. A letter from a mother in Aleppo to her son in Thessaloniki, written phonetically in Ottoman script, sending blessings for a wedding she could not attend. A note, unsigned, from a scribe in Bursa asking the central office if it was permissible to use leftover ink from court proceedings to copy poetry, provided it did not interfere with justice. Each of these is more than a curiosity. Each is a window. A heartbeat. A whisper. Because in the folds of old paper, we do not just find facts. We find feeling. And in that feeling, we remember that empires are not held together by swords or taxes, but by the small, stubborn insistence to reach across space with language. To say, I am here. Are you still there? The Ottoman Empire is gone now. Its palaces, emptied. Its banners, folded. Its laws, overwritten. But its letters remain. And through them, something lingers, not just of what the empire was, but of what it hoped to be, connected. There's something poetic, too, in the way it ended. Not with an explosion of paper. Not with a grand fire consuming archives. But with the slow replacement of ink by wire. Of parchment by signal. Of silence by immediacy. And yet, for a time, it worked. The letters moved. The pages turned. The scrolls unrolled. Someone folded a piece of paper, pressed a seal to it, and trusted a stranger to carry it through wilderness and wind, because they believed that words, once written, could still arrive. So if, one day, you find such a letter, maybe in a library, or a museum, or tucked between the pages of an old book, take a moment. Hold it gently. Read the edges. Notice where the ink falters. Where the hand trembled. Where the scribe coughed and started again. And know that this letter was never meant for you. And yet, here it is. Still folded. Still speaking. Still waiting to arrive. And perhaps that is the final truth of the Ottoman postal system, not that it was slow, or flawed, or peculiar, though it was all those things, but that it believed in the journey. Not just of messages, but of meaning. Of memory. Of connection. It was a system not of speed, but of sincerity. A system where a folded page was not just mail. It was a quiet act of reaching across the world, one hoofprint, one dusty scroll, one waiting hand at a time. And in the hush that follows its last delivery, it still echoes.